They say your home is your sanctuary. But what happens when the very people sworn to protect your neighborhood turn it into a battlefield? One morning, I woke up to find the HOA had made a decision so outrageous, so invasive, it felt like they had declared war on me and everything I had worked for. At first, I thought it was a mistake. But then the fines came, the threats followed, and soon the whispers around the block made it clear. I was their new target. How far would they go to break me? And how far would I go to fight back? For years, my ranch was more than just a piece of land. It was the place where I built my life, raised my family, and found peace away from the noise of the world. Wide stretches of pasture rolled into the distance. The old barn stood weathered but proud, and every sunrise painted the sky with a glow that reminded me why I had fought so hard to own this property. Out here, life was supposed to be simple. When we moved in, the community around us seemed quiet and welcoming. Neighbors waved from their porches, kids rode bikes along the dirt road, and the biggest concern anyone ever talked about was the weather. Sure, the homeowners association was there, sending out their usual newsletters and reminders, but I never thought much of it. Their rules seemed like background noise, something that applied more to the suburban streets than to someone living on a sprawling ranch at the edge of town. At first, I didn't even pay attention to the HOA meetings. I figured, why bother? My land was mine, my water was mine, and nobody in their right mind would care what I did out here. I kept to myself, fixed my fences, tended to my animals, and minded my own business. It wasn't that I was against community involvement, it just seemed unnecessary. What could possibly happen out here that needed an HOA's interference? But slowly, little hints began to surface. A neighbor mentioned that the HOA was getting more ambitious lately, pushing through new rules that didn't sit right with everyone. Another hinted that they had their eye on the land beyond the cul-de-sac, land like mine. At the time, I brushed it off as gossip. After all, who would want to pick a fight with a property owner who had every legal right to be there? Then came the first letter. It was small, almost laughable. A friendly reminder that my fence line might not be within guidelines. Guidelines? For ranch property that had been there longer than half the HOA board had been alive? I remember shaking my head, tossing the letter onto the kitchen counter, and thinking nothing of it. But that letter wasn't a mistake. It was a warning shot, because the truth was the HOA had bigger plans. And my land, my sanctuary, was right in the middle of it. The first letter should have been enough to warn me. But I ignored it, thinking it was just a clerical mistake. Some overzealous board member with too much time on their hands. What I didn't realize then was that it was the beginning of a war I never asked for. 2 weeks later, another notice arrived. This time, it wasn't a friendly reminder. It was an official violation. According to the HOA, part of my fence extended 3 feet beyond their so-called approved boundary. I stared at the paper in disbelief. This fence had been here long before I even bought the ranch. It wasn't just my fence. It was the original property line marker, hammered into the ground decades ago. I had title documents, county records, and surveys to prove it. But none of that mattered to them. The letter came with a fine, $250, and a warning. If I didn't correct the violation, more fines would follow. I tried calling the HOA office. No answer. I emailed the board. Silence. When I finally managed to attend one of their monthly meetings, thinking I could clear things up, I walked into a room full of polite smiles and condescending nods. They acted as though I was just misinformed, as though generations of property records and state-registered surveys were somehow less valid than their freshly printed guidelines. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about a fence. This was about control. Over the next few months, the harassment escalated. First, it was the fence. Then they claimed my barn's roof didn't meet visual standards. Visual standards? It was a working ranch barn, not a suburban garage. I patched the roof myself every season, and it stood strong through storms that ripped shingles off half the houses in town. But to the HOA, it was an eyesore. Another violation, another fine. Then came the water issue. This was the moment I knew they were circling something bigger. One morning, I got a letter marked urgent. The HOA had voted to install a community pipeline, running straight across my land. No request, no discussion, just a decision written in neat black print that they expected me to comply with. They even attached a consent form, asking for my signature to authorize temporary construction access. And if I didn't sign, they warned me that appropriate measures would be taken. That phrase, appropriate measures, stuck in my head like a knife. I refused, of course. My land wasn't theirs to carve up. But that's when the real games began. Within weeks, I was flooded with violation notices. Grass too long by 2 inches. A tractor parked in view of the road. A shed not painted in an approved color. Every ridiculous rule they could pull from their handbook suddenly became ammunition against me. Each violation carried a fine. $100 here, $250 there, $500 if they decided to double down. First, I tried to laugh it off, but the fines added up fast. By the end of the summer, they claimed I owed nearly $5,000. And the tone of their letters grew darker. They weren't just suggesting compliance anymore. They were threatening liens, legal action, even foreclosure if I didn't pay. That's when the neighbors started turning. Digging through the HOA's filings, I noticed a detail most people wouldn't care about. Their entire pipeline project depended on one key resource: water rights. Out here, water is life. And without a proper source, their shiny new pipeline would just be an empty tube in the ground. That's when I realized the irony. Their grand plan to expand control over the community relied on water that didn't legally belong to them yet. They hadn't secured the source. But I knew exactly where it was. It was a spring, a natural underground source just upstream from their planned pipeline route. And it wasn't owned by the HOA. It was owned privately, by a family who'd been quietly trying to sell off their acreage. I can still remember the mix of anger and adrenaline that hit me in that moment. They wanted to control my land? They wanted to bully me into submission? Fine. I would take the very ground out from under them. I made a call to the family who owned the spring. They were exhausted, tired of fighting the HOA themselves, and more than ready to sell. Within weeks, the deal was mine. The deed was signed, the rights transferred. Just like that, I owned the one thing the HOA needed more than my land: their water. And when they found out, the fallout was immediate. At the next board meeting, whispers turned to shouting. Their pipeline project screeched to a halt. They demanded I reconsider, accused me of sabotage, even threatened legal action. But all their bluster meant nothing, because I held the legal paperwork in my hands. They thought they could bully me into submission. Instead, I had cut off their lifeline. And that was only the beginning. Owning the water rights should have been the end of the fight. I thought once the HOA realized I controlled the very source their pipeline needed, they would back down. Maybe swallow their pride, admit defeat, and move on. But that's not how people drunk on power operate. Instead, they doubled down. The night of the emergency community meeting was electric. The board tried to ambush me with accusations, lies, and threats, but I walked in carrying the truth. When I stood before that room, holding up the deed to the water rights and exposing their failures, the tide turned instantly. Gasps echoed, neighbors shouted, the president lost control. By the time I finished laying out every petty violation, every fabricated fine, and every abuse of power, the silence was deafening. And then the community turned on them. The corrupt board was voted out, their schemes exposed, their power shattered. The ranch I nearly lost? Still mine. The water they tried to steal? Safely in my hands. And the lesson? Power built on lies and intimidation will always crumble. So I'll ask you, if someone tried to take away the place you call home, how far would you go to protect it? For me, the answer was simple. I went all the way.